April the 1st, April Fool's Day, 1997. I left home last Sunday and drove into Hermiston and did a little business there Monday morning, and then came back into Baker City last night and signed up Brad Allen for 4,000 plus bags of seed. The great MiddleFork of the Salmon saga is just about to unfold. Saga is the correcter word. Now, I can't remember when I become acquainted with the MiddleFork, but I've always been interested in river systems and streams and geography, and it come to my attention while I was a explorer scout leader there in Twin Falls that particular council was putting together a float trip down the MiddleFork of the Salmon River. Now, the MiddleFork of the Salmon River is located in some of the most pristine mountain country in the West, well, in the world. It's up right in the middle of the Frank Church Wilderness area. It's there in the central Idaho Rocky Mountain batholith that just goes on for miles and miles and miles. You can ride through those mountains for 1,150 miles and just cross a railroad track and a highway now and then. It's the roof of the world that goes through there. Now, the MiddleFork itself runs more north than any other direction. Maybe just a little bit west, but generally north, and that's pretty unusual too, because most of the rivers in that country are scrambling to try to get back to the ocean, which is west of them. The reason it does that, of course, is because that's the way those main mountain chains in there, the valleys are north and south valleys rather than east and west valleys. But it drains an area of, well, it's 106 or 7 miles long. It's formed where Morse Creek and Bear Valley Creek comes together, and each one of those creeks drain a lot of country. So there's several hundred square miles of this high mountainous country that accumulates in that MiddleFork. Now, there's no reservoir system or no restriction of flow on the MiddleFork of any kind. To the best of my knowledge, there's not a single stream comes out of the MiddleFork anywhere. It runs just as free and open as a river possibly could run. As a result of this, when there's snow in the mountains or rain in the hills, that water is all going to go down the river, and it's going to be solely determined by temperature and amount of rainfall, and if you get a big rainstorm, I've seen the river come up a foot in the spring of the year. If it gets hot and then rains, man, I've seen that river so high you'd have to duck your head to get under the bridge down at Indian Creek. And you go under that bridge sometime, you'll see what I'm saying. That water can get high in that river, and as you float that becomes where you can see the watermarks up on the bank, and you can see where it's plastered big logs against ledges and left them precariously hanging there. And man, you'd think you could push them off there with one hand, but you go over there and you and several Boy Scouts can't even wiggle them. They're lodged on there much solider than what you think. But the river starts in the high alpine country up there And I'm going to say, you know, somewhere around the 7,600 or 8,500 foot levels. Maybe some of it's a little higher than that. By the time you get on it there at Bear Valley, or at Dagger Falls, you're probably right at 6,800 foot. And you're probably going to lose 3,000, 3,400 feet elevation going down through there. So you go from the high alpine down through the grass country and then into the sheer huge granite formations that just rear up off that canyon for hundreds of feet, and then you come out down into the confluence of the main Salmon, and actually there it's quite low, and they have mild winters to a degree. You can get winter down there, but there's a lot of livestock winter on the bottom of the main Salmon and the MiddleFork, for that matter, from Big Creek on down. The river, while it's not a big river, it's a very technical river. And by that I mean you have to, if you got your boat in the right position, you can slide right through. But if you happen to have it in the wrong position, then you can really get yourself in a jackpot, because there's some places in there that it just pays to be where you need to be. But like I say, I was an explorer leader there in Twin Falls and teaching school, and it come to my attention that I could get some of my boys on that river. So we went to work, and I can't remember what it cost, somewhere in the neighborhood of $125, and I and 3 of my boys signed up for some of the first trips ever sponsored by the Snake River Area Boy Scouts. Now when we got up there, they've got a Boy Scout camp at Cape Horn, and I think now they call it Camp Bradley. At that time it was called Cape Horn Boy Scout Camp. And at that Boy Scout camp they had a lodge and kind of a staging area. They'd bring, they had the White Clouds 50 miler in there, and they had all kinds of merit badge schools, and on a given week up there in the summer there'd probably be 300 or 400 Boy Scouts, and then they'd rotate them every week. The Mormon church gets in there and really promotes that Boy Scout deal, so they get a lot of those boys cycling through there, and that's where the Whitewater group met. Now we got in there on a Sunday, thinking we were going to get on the river Monday morning, but it turned out that the powers that be determined that the river was too high. It was in too much of a flood stage. Now, of course, us Noviks, we couldn't believe anything like that. Heavens, we were ready to take on the wildest river the world had ever seen, you know. Never mind that none of us had ever done it before. But the Boy Scouts had gathered up a fellow by the name of Howard Kinsfather. And Kinsfather had a old Army surplus raft that he had put a fiber breastworks up around the front of it so the waves wouldn't come over quite so bad, and it was a 11-man boat, life raft, and the Boy Scouts had 2 or 3 of those along with his, and then in fact they had 9 or 10 of those. The Boy Scouts could get a hold of that surplus stuff, and so that's what they'd done. And then they had a 7-man lifeboat, which was 4 or 5 or 6 or 7 feet shorter than that bigger one. And on the 11-man, we'd put 5 guys, and on the 7-man we'd put 3. Now you'd have 2 guys up in the bow and 2 guys sitting on the side behind them in the stern, and then you'd have a rudder man on the back. That was 11-man. And then on the 7-man, you'd have 2 guys up in the bow and then the rudder man on the back. You'd just have the 3 paddlers. Now, it wasn't uncommon to have a rider, somebody that would just take turns of paddling or whatever, you know, but he'd set upon the gear or sleep or whatever he chose to do, and once in a while you'd have 1 or 2 of those. Now, that worked out pretty well because some of the kids weren't as strong as others. However, they did have a minimum physical requirement, and they had a minimum age. Now, at this particular time, river running was in its infancy. The MiddleFork had only been run by just a handful of people, and every one of them had really a bunch of stories to tell. And of course we hadn't heard any of them, so we were totally unaware of what we might be getting into. But Ken's father, he'd been on the river once, so he was a guide. And of course he had his own boat, which really, that looked impressive to me, you know. There was no limit to his knowledge as far as I was concerned. Now, I was probably 28 years old. Just started teaching school there in Twin and was in really good shape. I had these 3 boys with me, and I can't just remember their names, but they were good kids. That one red-headed kid was tougher than a pine knot, you know. He was just, he was a tough kid, and those other 2 weren't slouches at all. And so when we divvied up the boats, why, we latched onto one of those smaller boats. And the net result of that was supposed to be a better ride. You're supposed to get more bounce for the ounce and more buck for the buck, I guess. But we couldn't get on the river on Mondays, so we went up to the lake. They had a lake there at the Boy Scout camp, and they tied us up with a cotton rope and throwed us over the side. They paddled us out there in some of those rubber boats and then throwed us over the side, and we had to get untied and then come back up to the surface. I never could see where that had much to do with floating the MiddleFork, but it was something to do. Now, the other thing we had is, for lunch that day, we had sardine and boat and biscuit sandwiches. Now, a lot of you folks have never even heard of that particular fare, but those sardines were packed in oil and mustard. Those were the 2 bases we had. We never had any tomato base. And I remember it was kind of a warm day, and man, those sardines were anything but appetizing. And we opened up those cans of sardines and those Bolton biscuits. Now, the Bolton biscuits are just full of nutrients. It was some deal left over from World War II where they figured they could give those fighting men 2 or 3 of those biscuits and they could run for 140 miles without having to get anything else to eat. They really had them. Somebody had taken some time to really get a good recipe, you know. And so the fare, while it may not have been the most appealing in the world, it was certainly nourishing. And boy, those boys, they just wouldn't have anything to do with those sardine Bolton biscuit sandwiches. That was never on their menu, and they didn't intend to start making exceptions just to go down the MiddleFork. And I always liked sardines. And sardines and mustard is one of my favorite deals, so man, I had plenty to eat, and we finally prevailed on the people with better judgment that we better get them on the river. To hang around that camp for another day was going to do nothing but get people in trouble, because a lot of those folks, you know, they'd gathered up there from quite a long ways around, even from Twin Falls. It was 150 miles up there. And everybody had schedules, you know, had to get back. We were up there for a week's trip. And so the next day we loaded the boats up and loaded the bus up, and we headed up through Bear Valley and down Bear Valley Creek into the MiddleFork Canyon. And like I say, there at Niagara Falls, we had the jumping off place. And we got in there that evening of the second day and had a little time on our hands. We were going to camp there that night and then get underway the first thing in the morning. So we got the rafts on the river and got them blowed up full of air and set to go that way. And then it was, you know, warm summer evenings, and they had quite a little camping area in there. And I went up, there was a Minnesota license plate on this one station wagon, and he had a tent deal set up there. He had a pretty good camp set up, and I could see he'd been there for a little while, and so I got to visiting with him. He was a man probably 37 to 42 years old, and you could see he had a lot of savvy. And I said, "You're going to go down the river?" And he said, "No," he said, "I've changed my mind." He said, "I was going to canoe it, but I'm not going to do that now." And we visited a little while, and I said, "Well, boy, that turned into quite a trip to come out here to canoe the river and then not go." And he said, "Well, that's exactly right." He said, "I drove clear out here just to go down that in a canoe." And he said, "The ranger was here, and he advised me not to do it." And he said, "I told that ranger that I'd already paddled 26 major rivers, and this was going to be the 27th. That he wasn't dealing with somebody that hadn't been on rivers before and on rough water before." And right there from where we was sitting, you could probably see down the river 3/8 of a mile before it turned and went another direction. And he said, in between here and that corner, he said, "I capsized over 20 times." He said, "It wasn't a matter of paddling that canoe down the river. It was a matter of tipping it over and straightening it up and getting in and tipping it over and straightening it up." And he said, "I'm not good for 105 miles of that." And he said, "The ranger told me that this was some of the better part of it." Well, that was a canoe, and we had rubber rafts, so, man, I slept good that night, you know. I kind of hee-hawed about him. And then there was another outfit in there that come a-traipsing up the trail, and they had their gear on some pack horses there. They had some rubber boats and 2 rubber boats and some gold mining equipment. And they'd been over on the Locksaw River and 2 or 3 other rivers. They'd been out about all summer. And what their deal was, they had a little vacuum deal. Now, at that time, we could still have motors up in the MiddleFork. This is before it was a primitive area and before they made all those rules. And so they had a little motor there that produced a vacuum, and they'd send divers down in some of that crevicey rock bottom country and suck that sand and gravel and gold up out of those cracks, and they had quite a little gold. You know, I don't know how much. But they got on the MiddleFork, and they had a wreck at Velvet Falls, and they lost their gold, they lost part of their equipment, they lost their nerve, and so one guy hiked out and got this packer to come in and load their boats and what they had of their equipment left on their horses, and and hauled them back up out of that river. Well, that was the canoe man. We had rubber boats, and here these guys were in rubber boats, and they were coming back. But we had Kinsfather. We had a guide. We had a guy that'd been on that river before and owned his own ship, so surely that would have made him really a prominent, well-versed sea captain, you know. And besides that, he'd been in the Navy, as I had. And man, we were used to oceans, and this little old river wasn't going to cause us any trouble. So I slept good that night, and we got up early the next morning and had a little breakfast there. And of course the boys, they still weren't too hungry. They were pretty finicky about what they'd eat, you know. They had to have just about the right kind of breakfast cereal, and they weren't about to eat bacon and eggs and hotcakes. Boy, that's something they hadn't necessarily seen too much of. But we got breakfast and got cleaned up and got everything loaded up, and then old Kinsfather proceeded to show us how to lash that gear on those rubber rafts. Now, we had a metal frame that we tied on to the D-rings, and each of those boats were equipped with 4 of these big heavy-duty D-rings, and these frames were fashioned so that they fit those D-rings, so that your gear set right in the middle of your boat. And you'd put a pretty good pile of gear on there. You'd have 4 or 5 people, 5 or 6 people, and each one of them would have 40 or 50 pounds of gear, and then you had the camp gear to go with that. The grills and the axe and all the grub and the food boxes, and we kind of had it fixed so the food boxes had set down in to keep your center of gravity low, and we put those in waterproof boxes. And then everybody was instructed just what to do and what to keep out and what to keep in. And I remember at that time, zinc oxide was a big plus. You're supposed to keep your zinc oxide out to put on your lips and your nose and your face and keep from getting sunburned, see. Well, there was a guy or two that they had plenty of sunshine, and they had pans, and so they had some legs sticking out, and some guys that hadn't bothered to necessarily wear just the regulation hat that had been recommended. But all in all, we were ready to go. Now, there was a bunch of us. We had to have, we had 11 boats, and you figure a minimum of 5 people to a boat. There was 61 or 62 of us total. And generally every 5 or 6 or 4 or 5 boys had an adult leader. So let's say 1 out of every 4 was an adult. And by an adult, that was somebody 18, 19 years old up to 50 or 60 years old. There was no women along. It was strictly a male chauvinist trip. We later had to change that, and Kinsfather cast off. He was the captain, he was the leader, and away they went. Well, my job was to sweep the river. I had these stalwart young men. I had 2 good paddlers and myself, and then a man to handle the rope, and our instructions were to leave no one hanging on the rocks. If we see somebody on the rocks, we were to paddle over there and either load him up or throw in the rope and drag him off and load him in our boat. And boy, all that stuff was gobbledygook to me. I didn't have any idea what they were talking about or how to take care of any of that stuff, you know. But we'd made quite a little splash there in camp and had a lot to say about what we could do and what we thought we could do, and they didn't need to worry about us. Heavens, at high water, all it'd do is make the ride a little more enjoyable, you know. And it was within a foot or two of being full flood. And when I say a foot or two, that's in elevation, and that's the way they give the depth of the river is in elevation. Now, at that time, there was just a round rock out in the river, and it's still what I use today. But since then, the Forest Service has put in a depth, sophisticated gauge down at Indian Creek, down at the lodge there. Harris Club out of Nevada come in there and built just a nice place, and the Forest Service put in a measurement there, and they radio out every day what the river is. So now all the guides and all the people on the river, they get an update every 24 hours on the depth of the river at Indian Creek. Well, Ken's father was gone, and 9 boats behind him, and we were the 11th, and away we went. And man, we never got in any serious trouble till we got almost to the corner down there. And boy, when we went around that corner, that river fell to pieces, and suddenly it dawned on us that we had our hands full. But we immediately established a positive attitude, and that's so important to do. Now keep in mind, not a single one of us on that boat had ever gone down the river before. We had never done any whitewater rafting before. And boy, it took us a little while, but there was plenty of opportunities to train the crew. And we soon learned how to maneuver that boat. And we learned how to maneuver it very precisely. And with the paddle strength we had, man, we could spin that thing around like a grasshopper. And when I say spin it around, boy, that was the maneuver you used on a lot of times. And we learned that you put your bow into treble and then back paddle and cushion yourself, and then make your turn or your move after you've seen the river. We learned to follow those green tongues into those rapids, and we learned to read that river so we knew where we were going and where we wanted to be. And boy, that river was a harsh teacher. Well, the first major obstacle was Sulphur Slide, but Sulphur Slide, when the river's high, is just a bunch of boiling white water. Man, it just sounds really, really terrible, but it's not that bad in a rubber raft. Now, with a canoe, I think a canoe there, you'd just be absolutely swamped. The little kayakers, in later years, they got to running it, and boy, they could dart around. Those good kayakers, they got to be professional type people. This was, again, when river running was in its infancy, and none of this stuff was really even, they had kayaks, but I'd never seen one, and I don't think there'd ever been one on the river, ever.